She had waited 1,000 years for her release. Ancient magic had chosen her husband for her automatically, the first mortal to enter the hall. And then the seal broke. The power surged outward and bound itself to the body on the floor. The Queen of Demons bent down to look at the one to whom she was now bound for eternity. And she saw a guy in a coffee shop apron, sneakers, an untied shoelace. He blinks and asks if there's a kitchen nearby. Let's rewind a minute. Dan opens his eyes. Above him is a stone ceiling covered in runes that are fading one by one. Blue light fades from the symbols as if someone were turning off light bulbs in a long corridor. Dan tries to sit up. His body won't obey. His hands feel foreign. His legs ache as if he'd been lying on concrete for a week. He turns his head and stares intently at the face. Very close, very beautiful, with horns. 2 curved horns stick out of dark hair like a crown someone forgot to take off. Eyes the color of molten pomegranate bore into him without blinking. The girl blinks, slowly, like a cat, and utters a single word, husband. Then she adds that he's 1,000 years late. And this is where the strangest part begins. Dan doesn't panic. His brain throws up only one thought. Again. Something has fallen on him. Again. Only this time, the Queen of Demons has fallen on him. He sits down on the second try. The hall is enormous. Columns stretch into the darkness. The floor is crisscrossed by concentric circles of runes. The air smells of ozone and burnt sugar. Dan looks himself over. A coffee shop apron, sneakers. The left one's lace is untied, the very one that made him slow down. He leaned against a stone. He's fallen down here. A woman is 3 steps away. Tall, dark hair falls below her shoulder blades. Her black dress looks as if it were woven from the night sky. She eyes him from head to toe. Her gaze lingers on the apron, on the untied shoelace, and she says she's been waiting 1,000 years and apparently waited in vain. Dan stands up. His legs are wobbly, but they hold him up. There are no windows, no exit in sight, just the columns, the runes, and her. He asks where he is. She replies that this is the Hall of the First Seal, a castle on the edge of the continent of Ayrton, the place where she was imprisoned 1,000 years ago. Dan nods, not because he understands, but because this is far from the strangest morning of his life. Once, he came in for his shift and found the coffee shop flooded. The culprit turned out to be a pigeon stuck in a pipe. The pigeon survived. The coffee shop did not. Against this backdrop, ending up in another world is almost logical. He asks what spouse means. The woman sits down on a stone ledge. Her movement is so graceful that Dan forgets about the horns for a second. She explains in the tone of a professor tired of freshmen. The seals have held her for 1,000 years with a safety mechanism. The seal will weaken. She will emerge. The power will bind itself to the first mortal in the hall. The spouse contract. Ancient magic. And dissoluble. She recites the spell. He lets it pass through him. Without him, she cannot cast spells. Without her, he is useless. A perfect trap for both of them. Dan processes this for about 30 seconds. Then he asks the only important question. Is there a kitchen here? The woman falls silent for the first time. Her eyebrow creeps up a millimeter. She says he's the first mortal in 1,000 years who hasn't fainted, run away, or started praying. And he asks about the kitchen. Daniel shrugs. He hasn't eaten since the night shift. On an empty stomach, he has a hard time processing information about magical marriage contracts. And if he's going to be someone's husband in a foreign world, he might as well start with breakfast. She stares at him for 5 seconds, then she stands up. She mentions that her name is Lilith von Ayrton, Queen of Demons, Mistress of the Abyss, Lady of the 7 Circles, and that the kitchen is on the 2nd floor, though there's probably nothing left there but dust. Dan ties his shoelace, adjusts his apron, follows her. The torches on the walls flare up with violet fire as they pass by. Water drips from the ceiling in places. Lilith strides ahead, silently, back straight, chin lifted, as if a retinue of 1,000 courtiers were trailing behind her. Dan thinks on the go, and he's surprised himself that he isn't panicking. Maybe because panic requires the belief that the situation can be fixed. And over the course of 23 years, he's gotten used to the fact that situations just happen. Signs fall, pipes burst, the tax office sends letters. You don't fix them, you adapt. The kitchen greets them with a disaster. Stone countertops, a stove the size of a garage, a layer of dust an inch thick. The dishes are broken. Something small with a tail scurries into the corner. Dan checks the stove. It works. He jiggles the faucet. The water is rusty, but it flows. He rolls up his sleeves and asks her to light the fire. Lilith raises her hand. Nothing. She raises it again. Nothing. She stares at her palm as if it had betrayed her, then at Dan, and it dawns on him. The channel. The 1,000-year-old queen of demons can't light a fire in her own kitchen without permission from a guy in an apron from Portland. Lilith barks something in an ancient language. From the tone, it's a choice curse. She explains through gritted teeth. She forms a spell. He ignores it. He just wants fire. Dan thinks about fire. A 2-meter-high purple flame shoots up from the hearth. The heat hits his face. He flinches. Lilith reduces the flame to normal with a single gesture and mutters that a sense of proportion will come with time. Maybe. For the next 3 hours, Dan cleans the kitchen, scrubs, scrapes. In the pantry, he finds something like grains and dried meat. He sniffs it. It's not poisoned. Probably. Lilith is sitting at the table. At first, she's silent. Then she starts talking. Not because she wants to, but because the silence in the castle has lasted 1,000 years and has become unbearable. She tells him about Ayrton, about the 5 kingdoms, about the Church of the Holy Flame, which for 1,000 years has drummed into people's heads that any demon is evil, about the Order of the Silver Dawn, which patrols the seals, about how the seals are weakening. Demons have spoken again. Contracts with demons are traded on the black markets. Everyone is waiting for the end, and no one believes in it. Dan listens. He stirs his porridge. He asks questions, not stupid ones. How many soldiers are in the order? How far is the nearest town? Does the castle have legal status? With each answer, something new emerges in her voice. Not warmth, more like curiosity, like a scientist examining a rare specimen. The porridge is simple. Grains with meat. No spices because there are no spices. Dan divides it between 2 plates and places one in front of Lilith. She looks at the plate, then at him, then back at the plate. She hasn't eaten in 1,000 years. She didn't need to. But the body is physical. Feel. She picks up a spoon. She tastes it. The porridge is the most ordinary kind, but Lilith chews slowly, like someone who has forgotten what it's like to eat at a table with someone. Dan finishes his meal and is already planning tomorrow to explore the castle, to find the living quarters, figure out the plumbing, make a list. He always makes lists. They turn chaos into a sequence of steps, and he knows how to follow steps. Lilith pushes her plate away. She stares at him with that same scrutinizing gaze. She says that over 1,000 years, she's gone through 1,000 versions of her future husband. A warrior, a mage, a king, a saint, a madman, and in none of them was he a guy in an apron who fixes the kitchen first thing. Dan washes the dishes. He replies that it's his most useful skill. People go to war on an empty stomach, but no one fights after a good dinner. Lilith watches for another 10 seconds. Then she stands up and leaves. She pauses at the door. Without turning around, she says his room is the 3rd door on the right, and that she'll explain everything else in the morning. Dan finds the room. The bed is dusty but intact. He takes off his apron. He lies down. The runes on the ceiling aren't glowing, just an ordinary stone. He lies there and thinks, another world, magic, a contract, the queen of demons, complete nonsense, and yet totally his style, because if anyone in the whole world is capable of accidentally leaning against an ancient artifact and becoming the husband of a 1,000-year-old demoness, then of course it's him. The Dan effect. Extended version. He closes his eyes, falls asleep in 3 minutes. Habit. After night shifts, you pass out fast. The morning began with a crash. Dan jumped up in bed. The rumbling was coming from below, from under the floor, as if someone were hitting a rock with a sledgehammer. He slipped on his sneakers and ran out into the hallway. Torches flared purple. He ran toward the sound, down a flight of stairs, then another, now a hallway. The smell of sulfur. Dan burst into a hall that was smaller than the Hall of Seals, but still enormous, and he saw it. Lilith stood in the center of the hall, back straight, arms at her sides. Before her, a crack a meter wide gaped in the stone floor, and a figure was rising from the crack, short, graceful, with long, rose-silver hair and a ponytail that swayed behind her back like a pendulum. The girl emerged fully from the crack. She brushed off her dress. She looked at Lilith. Her eyes were bright pink, unnatural, as if lit from within. She fell to one knee before Lilith. She said that Serafina, general of pleasure and dreams, had come at the call of her queen. Then she raised her eyes. She saw Dan in the doorway. Her gaze swept over him from head to toe, slowly, appraisingly. The tail behind her back stopped swaying and froze. She turned to Lilith and asked what that was. Not who, what. Lilith replied that it was her husband. Serafina was silent for 3 seconds. Then she began to laugh. Dan stood in the doorway and waited for her to finish. It took about a minute. Serafina wiped away a tear. She looked at him again. She said it was a joke. Lilith replied that the contract was active and that it wasn't a joke. Serafina stopped smiling. Her pink eyes narrowed. She looked at Dan with a gaze that would make a normal person's knees buckle. Concentrated desire. A succubus in combat mode. Dan felt something strange, as if a warm wave had washed over his body. Pleasant, alluring, and at the same time empty, like a pretty wrapper without candy. His inner detector went off. Not a lie, but not the truth either. Just a habit, an automatic response. She did it as naturally as he made coffee. Dan blinked. The wave subsided. He looked at Serafina and asked if she'd had breakfast. Serafina froze. The tail behind her twitched. Once. She turned to Lilith with an expression that said she needed an explanation. Lots of explanations. Dan spent the next hour in the kitchen. Porridge for 3. Serafina sat at the table and listened to Lilith's explanations. From time to time, she glanced at Dan. He could feel her gaze on his back. Not hostile, more like puzzled, like a cat that has spotted a cucumber and is trying to figure out if it poses a threat. Lilith explained everything. The contract, the channel, the restrictions. Serafina listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question. She asked what would happen if she killed him. Lilith replied that the channel would be severed and her power would become permanently inaccessible. Serafina nodded. She looked at Dan. She said that in that case, she wouldn't kill him. Bye. Dan set a bowl of porridge in front of her. She said thank you automatically and was surprised herself that she'd said it. A crash rang out again, but not from below this time. From above, from the roof. Dan looked up at the ceiling. Dust was falling. Something heavy struck the stone, again and again. Then the section of the ceiling in the far wing of the castle collapsed, and through the cloud of dust, a figure entered the hallway. Tall, very tall, a head taller than Dan. Broad-shouldered, with dark green skin and short red hair. The axe on its back was bigger than Dan was from head to toe. She stopped. She drew in a breath through her nostrils. Her yellow eyes found Lilith. She stepped forward. The floor shook. Branwen Bloodaxe, General of War. She dropped to one knee before Lilith. She said she had felt the call for 3 days. She had walked without stopping. She had hacked her way through the rotten forest. She had killed 12 wyverns along the way. She was hungry. Lilith pointed to the kitchen. Bran stood up. She saw Dan. She stopped. She sniffed. She frowned. She asked Lilith why the castle smelled of humans. Lilith explained. Bran listened. Her expression didn't change. When Lilith finished, Bran turned to Dan. She stepped right up close. She leaned in. She sniffed his neck. Dan stood motionless, not because he was brave, but because moving seemed like a bad idea next to a creature that kills wyverns with her bare hands. Bran straightened up. She said he smelled like food. Dan replied that he did. He had just been cooking. Bran nodded. She said she liked him. She turned and went to the kitchen. Dan exhaled. He looked at Lilith. Lilith shrugged almost imperceptibly. In the kitchen, Bran ate 6 servings. Dan cooked non-stop. Serafina watched with an expression of disgusted admiration. Lilith drank water and said nothing. Bran finished eating. She looked at Dan and said simply and directly that he was now her husband too, because he was a good cook. Serafina choked. Lilith raised an eyebrow. Dan paused for a second. Then he said he was flattered and thanked her. Bran nodded solemnly, as if the matter were settled, and reached for a 7th serving. The 3rd one appeared in the evening. No crash, no destruction, just the castle door opened and a woman walked in. White hair down to her waist, blue eyes, a posture like a statue. Every step measured, every movement calculated. Rhaena Silverfrost, General of Ice and Strategy. She did not kneel. She bowed exactly as much as protocol required, not a degree more. Lilith nodded. Something invisible passed between them. not warmth, more like mutual recognition. Two aristocrats, each knew her own worth. Reyna surveyed the castle, a cold, appraising gaze. She noted the cracks in the walls, the leaks, the collapsed wing, dust. She said the castle was in a disastrous state and that a restoration plan was needed. Then she saw Dan. Her expression didn't change, not at all. She turned to Lilith and asked who this man was and why he was wearing an apron. Lilith explained. Reyna listened, silently, not a single question. When Lilith finished, Reyna walked around Dan, slowly, like a shopper examining merchandise. She stopped in front of him. She said that the spousal agreement was a political tool of immense value, that a strategy for its use needed to be developed immediately, that she already had 17 preliminary plans. Dan nodded. He asked if she wanted tea. Reyna opened her mouth, closed it. For the first time that evening, something flashed in her icy eyes. Confusion. She said yes, she wanted tea. Thank you. Dinner that evening was the first for the five of them. Dan had been cooking for 2 hours. The porridge was no good. He found more supplies in the pantry, dried root vegetables, something resembling beans, herbs that smelled like thyme. It turned into a stew, simple, thick, hot. He divided it among 5 plates, set them on the table, sat down last. Lilith ate in silence, neatly. Royal manners even at a broken stone table. Serafina poked at her food with a fork. Her tail was wrapped around the chair leg. Bran ate with her hands. No one objected. Reyna ate with impeccable poise, back straight, elbows off the table. Dan watched them. 4 beings from another world. A demoness, a succubus, an orc, an icy aristocrat. All deadly dangerous, all at one table. All of them were eating his stew. He thought that if someone had told him a week ago that his main survival skill in another world would be cooking, he wouldn't have been surprised, because that was totally his style. Bran finished first. She looked at Dan. She said it was delicious, loudly. Serafina said it was quite passable for an improvisation. Reyna said nothing, but her plate was empty. Lilith looked up from her plate. She looked at Dan, then at her 3 generals, then back at Dan. She said that tomorrow they would start tidying up the castle, all 4 of them, under his leadership, because obviously he was the only one here who understood how daily life worked. Dan blinked. Lilith added that it wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of a regrettable fact. Dan cleared the table by himself. He washed the dishes, he cleaned the pot. He thought. A week ago, he'd been making lattes for office workers. Now he was cooking dinner for 4 demonic generals in a castle at the edge of the world. And the strangest thing, the most absurd thing, he felt calm. Not good, not bad, calm. As if he'd been walking somewhere his whole life and had finally arrived. He chalked it up to exhaustion. He went to bed. He fell asleep in a minute. The first week transformed the castle from ruins into something vaguely resembling a dwelling. Dan made a 32-item list. Bran carried stones to repair the collapsed wing. She carried a half-ton stone under her arm. Reyna designed a drainage system for the leaking walls. Serafina discovered that her dream magic worked on small creatures and drove an entire colony of something tailed and toothy out of the cellars. They simply fell asleep and wandered off into the forest in their sleep. Lilith helped through the channel. Each time, Dan had to give mental permission. By the 3rd day, it had become almost automatic. He thought of fire, and fire appeared. He thought of light, and the runes on the walls came to life. He thought of warmth, and the stone beneath his feet stopped being icy. Lilith watched him. When he asked how he managed to perform magic so easily, she replied that she didn't know, that the previous bearer of the treaty had trained for months before he could light a candle. And Dan, on the 3rd day, was heating up an entire wing of the castle. She said this in an even tone, without emotion, but Dan sensed something. His sincerity detector twitched. Not a lie, but not the whole truth either. She was holding something back. He didn't press her. He decided to wait. On the 4th day, Dan set about arranging the rooms. Each of the 4 was to have their own space. He knew that for sure. 5 years in a dorm had taught him that people who share space without personal territory sooner or later kill each other. And these weren't people. These were demons. The stakes were higher. For Lilith, he chose the largest room in the upper tower, with windows on all sides. She had spent 1,000 years locked away. She needed a view. He found heavy, dark burgundy curtains in the castle library. He hung them himself. He found an armchair with a high back. He fixed the leg. He placed it by the window. He placed 3 books from the library that seemed interesting to him on the table. Lilith came in that evening. She stopped in the doorway. She looked around for a long time. She didn't say a word, but when Dan walked past in the morning, he heard the chair creak. She was sitting by the window, reading. For Serafina, he chose the room with the softest light, the south side, warm stone tones. He found some fabric in one of the chests and draped the walls so that the room looked like a tent, soft, cozy, no sharp corners. Serafina walked in and said nothing. Then she said it wasn't her style, that she was used to luxury, to silk, to gold. Dan nodded. He replied that when they found silk and gold, he would redo it. For now, this would have to do. Serafina sat down on the bed. She ran her hand over the fabric on the wall and quietly said that she actually liked it. Her tail wrapped around her own waist. Dan noticed she does that when she's nervous, like a person hugging themselves with their arms. For Bran, he chose the most spacious room on the first floor, next to the exit to the courtyard. She doesn't like enclosed spaces. Dan realized this on the second day when she broke through a wall because she thought the hallway was too narrow. He didn't put up many furniture. A wide bed, a weapons rack, a large window that he had widened by asking Lilith via the channel to carefully remove a section of stone. Bran walked in. She looked at the weapons rack. She hung up her axe. She looked at the window. She walked over. She turned her face to the wind. She turned to Dan. She smiled, widely, sincerely. She had fangs. The smile was the most beautiful thing Dan had seen all week. For Reyna, he chose a room in the north wing, cool, quiet, away from the others. He'd noticed that Reyna got tired of the noise, from Bran in particular. He found a desk, a large one, with drawers. He set out the ink and a stack of blank paper he'd found in the library. He placed a stone on the windowsill, smooth, pale blue, cold to the touch, just a beautiful stone. Reyna walked in. She looked around the room. She walked over to the desk. She ran her finger over the surface, clean. She looked at the paper, at the ink, then at the stone on the windowsill. She picked it up. Her fingers trembled for a second. She asked why the stone. Dan said it looked beautiful, thought she'd like it. Reyna put the stone back. In an even voice, she said the stone was acceptable, and she left. But Dan saw it. For a split second, her fingers squeezed the stone a little tighter than necessary. On the 5th day, the first real clash occurred, not with an enemy, among their own. Serafina and Reyna hadn't spoken to each other at all since day 1. Dan sensed something heavy between them, something old. Whenever they found themselves in the same room, the temperature literally dropped. Reyna, because of her magic, Serafina responded by strengthening her aura of attraction. The result was like an ice-cold shower and a hot bath at the same time. Unbearable. On the 5th day at breakfast, Serafina let slip something about the Silverfrost house, something about how they had traded succubus slaves 200 years ago. Her voice was light, playful, as always, but her words were poison. Reyna froze with a spoon in her hand. The air in the kitchen grew so cold that steam rose from Dan's mouth. Reyna replied that the Silverfrost house had stopped the slave trade 100 years before the fall, and that if anyone here had been trading in other people's bodies, it was general pleasure. Serafina stopped smiling. Her pink eyes darkened. The tail behind her back grew stiff as a spear. Bran kept eating. She didn't understand what was happening. Lilith watched, silently, without interfering. Dan stood by the hearth. He sensed both of them. Serafina's pain, sharp as glass. She wasn't joking. She was seeking revenge for something old. Reyna's anger, cold as her magic. She wasn't angry. She was defending herself from shame. Dan took the kettle off the hearth. He poured 2 mugs of tea. He placed one in front of Serafina, the other in front of Reyna. He said the tea was hot and that it was best to drink it before it cooled. Both looked at him, then at the mugs. The moment passed. It didn't resolve itself, but it passed. Serafina picked up her mug with her tail. Reyna lifted hers with both hands. Dan sat down. He started eating, as if nothing had happened. Because sometimes, the best way to defuse a bomb is to pretend it isn't ticking. On the 6th day, Dan discovered the library, not the small collection from which he'd been taking books, a real library. 3 floors, thousands of volumes, scrolls, maps, documents with seals that looked very official. He spent 4 hours there. He couldn't read the local language, but the maps were understandable. He found a map of the continent, 5 kingdoms. Airten was enormous. The castle of the seal was located at the very edge, on the border between demon territory and the human kingdom of Veldmar. It was a 3-day journey to the nearest town. He found a map of the castle itself. The Hall of the Seal was in the center. The castle was built around it. 6 towers, 4 wings. Dungeons extending 3 levels down, an outer wall, a moat. Everything was abandoned, but structurally intact. Dan looked at the map and thought, the castle was a fortress. It was in a strategically important position, between 2 worlds. If anyone found out that Lilith was here, this place would become a target. He needed a legend, an official reason for its existence. No one attacks a noble estate without a reason. They attack a den of demons. So the castle must become an estate. He found Lilith in the tower. She was sitting in a chair by the window, reading. He asked if the Von Aerten family was a genuine noble house. Lilith looked at him over the top of her book. She replied that Aerten was the name of the continent, that she had given him his name 1,000 years ago, that every noble family on this continent is formally her vassal, though everyone has long since forgotten this, that in the heraldic registers, the House of Von Aerten stands first. It always has. Dan smiled. For the first time in a week, Lilith asked why he was smiling. Dan replied that he had an idea. He needed her blood, 1 drop, and a little paper. Lilith looked at him. Then she slowly closed the book. She said he was a strange man. Dan replied that he'd been told so. He spent the next 2 hours drafting a document, a deed of inheritance for the castle and the surrounding lands in the name of Daniel von Aerten, the head of the household's spouse. He didn't know how to write in the local language, so Reyna helped. She didn't ask any questions. She understood the plan by the 3rd sentence. She looked at Dan with new eyes. She said that for a man without an education, he thought surprisingly systematically. Dan replied that 5 years of working in a coffee shop taught you one thing. Bureaucracy is defeated by bureaucracy. Lilith dripped blood onto the seal. The document flashed gold for a second. Ancient family magic. Authenticity cannot be forged. Dan carefully rolled up the document. He tucked it into his bosom. Now, if anyone came, he was ready. On the 7th day, no one came. It was quiet. Dan cooked. He cleaned. He read maps. He practiced pronouncing local words. Bran trained in the courtyard. The sound of an axe striking stone became as familiar as the ticking of a clock. Serafina slept until noon. She came out in her robe. Dan silently poured her something hot. She took it without a word. Reyna worked at the table. She wrote. She calculated. She made plans. Lilith sat in the tower. She read. Sometimes she went out and stood on the castle wall, gazing at the horizon. Dan once brought her a mug upstairs. He just set it down beside her. He didn't say anything. He laughed. When he came back down, he sensed something through the channel. Faint, warm, like a ray of sunlight through a gap in the curtains. He didn't understand what it was, but it made him feel good. They arrived on the 10th day. Dan heard them before he saw them. Bran looked up from her breakfast. Her ears twitched. She said there were 10 people outside in heavy armor, marching in formation. Silver. Dan went to the window. 10 figures in silver cloaks were climbing the path to the castle. A tall man with a sword at his belt led the way. The Order of the Silver Dawn. Lilith rose from the table. Her eyes darkened. The air around her grew heavy. She said she could destroy them through the channel, with a single spell. Dan shook his head. He said no. Lilith turned to him. There was a warning in her gaze. She said they were knights of the Order. They were searching for the source of the magical anomaly. They would find it, and they wouldn't stop. Dan nodded. He said he knew, and that was exactly why he would go out to them alone. 4 pairs of eyes stared at him. Bran stood up. The axe was already in her hand. Serafina held her breath. Reyna started to say something but stopped. Lilith just watched. Dan pulled a letter from his bosom. He unfolded it. He checked the seal. Lilith's blood shimmered with a pale gold glow. He put on a clean shirt he'd found in one of the chests. It was a little too big, but it would do. He took off his apron. He thought for a moment, put it back on, took it off again, smoothed his hair, took a deep breath. and stepped out. The castle courtyard was empty and clean. Bran had cleared it 2 days ago. The sun was shining. The wind carried the scent of pine needles from the nearby forest. 10 knights stood at the gate, swords drawn, shields raised, silver cloaks gleamed, beautiful, intimidating. The captain stepped forward, young, about 30, a stern face, a scar on his chin. He demanded to know his name and an explanation of what sorcery emanated from this place. His voice was loud. He was used to giving orders. Dan stopped 5 paces away. He bowed, not too low, exactly as he'd seen in the illustrations in the library book on etiquette. He said his name was Daniel von Aerten, the owner of this estate. The captain narrowed his eyes. He asked which house. Dan replied that it was the von Aerten house. The captain was silent for 2 seconds. Then he said he didn't know of such a house. Dan held out the letter. The captain took it, unfolded it, read it for a long time. Dan stood there, waiting, counting the seconds. Watching the captain's face, he saw how his eyes changed. First suspicion, then surprise, then confusion. The seal was genuine, the blood of an ancient house, impossible to forge. The name von Aerten was listed in the heraldic registers. Number 1, it had always been there. It's just that no one thought this house still existed. The captain looked up. He asked who had signed the letter. Dan replied that it was Lilith von Aerten, his wife, head of the family. The captain looked at the signature again. The name Lilith meant nothing to him. In the history of the Order, the Queen of Demons was called the Mistress of the Abyss, the ruler of darkness, the Cursed One, but never by name, and certainly not with an aristocratic pretext. The captain rolled up the letter. He handed it back. His posture shifted. His sword dropped. He said that the Order had detected a powerful magical surge in the area a week ago, that they were obliged to investigate. Dan nodded. He replied that yes, there had been a surge. He had activated the estate's protective spells upon inheriting the property. Ancient family magic, a one-time procedure. It wouldn't happen again. The captain exchanged glances with his men. One of the knights said something quietly. The captain nodded. He turned to Dan. He asked if the Order could inspect the estate. Standard procedure. Dan smiled, polite, just as he smiled at customers in the coffee shop when they asked for a discount he couldn't give. He replied that, unfortunately, the estate was undergoing restoration. Construction work was everywhere. It wasn't safe. But he would be happy to host the inspection in a month when the main work was finished. In the meantime, would the esteemed knights like some tea to refresh themselves after their journey? The captain stood there, thinking. Dan could sense him. The detector was working. The captain didn't trust him, but he also saw no reason for aggression. The letter was genuine. A nobleman has the right to refuse an inspection. Tea was offered. Formally, everything was correct. Formally, there was no fault to be found. The captain declined the tea. He said that the Order would return in a month, that any suspicious activity would be investigated. Dan bowed. He thanked him for his service. The captain turned away. 10 silver cloaks walked down the path. Dan stood in the courtyard until they disappeared behind the trees. Then he exhaled. His legs were shaking. He sat down right on a rock. His hands were trembling. His mouth was dry. He sat there for a minute. 2, 3. Then he stood up and went inside. 4 faces were waiting for him in the kitchen. Bran stood with an axe at the ready. Serafina sat on the table. Her tail twitched nervously. Rhaena stood by the wall, motionless. Lilith sat in a chair. Everyone was silent, waiting. Dan walked over to the hearth. He put the kettle on. His hands were still shaking. He turned around. He said they had left, that they would be back in a month, that they had time. Bran slowly lowered the axe. Serafina exhaled so deeply that her tail went limp. Rhaena tilted her head slightly. Lilith didn't move. She was looking at Dan for a long time. Her eyes were strange. There was something in them he hadn't seen before. She asked what that was just now. Dan shrugged. He replied that it was bureaucracy, that that's how they fend off the taxman in Portland. Lilith blinked. Then the corner of her mouth twitched. Not a smile, a shadow of a smile. Her ghost. But for the 1,000-year-old Queen of Demons, it was a breakthrough. Reina was the first to break the silence. She said the plan was primitive, crude, full of holes, that any competent investigator would have figured it out in an hour, and that, nevertheless, it had worked. Because Dan had taken the main thing into account. The Knights of the Order aren't looking for nobles, they're looking for demons. Show them a noble and they'll walk away. She looked at Dan with something resembling respect, microscopic, but real. Serafina laughed. She said it was the most boring and most effective battle she'd seen in 300 years. Bran frowned. She said she didn't understand. Why not fight? Dan explained. If you kill 10 knights, the Order will send 100. If 100, then 1,000. If you show them a letter, they'll send one accountant in a month. And Dan knows how to work with accountants. Bran thought about it for a whole minute. Then she nodded. She said it was clever, like hunting wolves. You don't chase them, you set a trap. Dan didn't bother to point out that there were no wolves in Portland. He poured tea, 5 cups. He sat down at the table. He drank in silence. Serafina drank, Bran drank, Reina drank, Lilith drank. The silence was different, not tense, not empty, just quiet, like after a storm. That night, Dan couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark and thought. He had deceived the Knights of the Order, armed, magically enhanced elite warriors, with a letter drawn in charcoal and sealed with a demoness's blood. And they left. It worked. Bureaucracy worked in this world. Laws worked. Status worked. So fighting with force wasn't necessary. There was another way, a smarter way. He lay there and, for the first time since his transfer, felt that he had a plan. Not a finished one, not a perfect one, but a direction. The castle would become an estate. The estate would become a home. The home would become a refuge. And the refuge could become something greater, if everything was done right, if he didn't rush, if he brewed tea on time. Dan smiled in the darkness. He rolled onto his side. He fell asleep. The second month began with a problem Dan hadn't anticipated. Food was running out. The 1,000-year-old supplies in the pantry turned out not to be endless. The grain was running low. The dried meat had run out a week ago. Bran hunted in the forest, but one hunter couldn't feed 5 people, especially since Bran ate for 3. They needed a town. They needed money. They needed contact with the outside world. Reina unfolded the map on the kitchen table. The nearest town was called Veldheim, a 3-day walk, the capital of a border barony, a trading town, a population of about 5,000. She knew it from old intelligence reports. 1,000 years ago, it had been a village. Dan asked what they could sell. Reina thought. There were things in the castle, ancient, some valuable, but selling artifacts from the castle would attract attention. Serafina suggested another option. She said that mushrooms grew in the castle's cellars, lots of them. She had seen them when she was driving out the tailed creatures. Some of these mushrooms were alchemical ingredients, rare, expensive. On the black market, they'd pay top dollar for them without haggling. Dan rejected the black market. He said legal trade, only legal, no shady deals. Reina raised an eyebrow. She asked why. Dan explained. The black market is connections. Connections are information. Information is leaks. One conversation in a tavern, and a week later, the whole continent knows that someone in Von Aerten Castle is trading in demonic mushrooms. Legal trade is boring. Boring means inconspicuous. Reina was silent for 5 seconds. Then she said he was right, and that it was annoying. Dan and Serafina set off for Veldheim. The choice of companion was obvious. Bran was too conspicuous. Reina was too cold. Lilith was too dangerous. Serafina could hide her horns and tail with an illusion. In human form, she looked like a young noblewoman, beautiful, striking, drawing attention, but not suspicion. The journey took 2 days. Serafina cast an illusion for both of them through the channel. Dan felt the magic as a light tingling on his skin. They walked through the forest, then through the foothills, then along the trade route. Serafina chattered non-stop. She talked about the world, about the demonic kingdoms, about the intrigues at Lilith's court 1,000 years ago, about her life. She spoke easily, playfully. Every sentence had a subtext, a hint, a provocation. Dan listened. He answered in monosyllables, not because he didn't want to talk, but because listening was more interesting. During the evening rest stop, Serafina sat down next to him, close. Her knee touched his. She asked if he was cold. Her voice was soft, enveloping. The detector was silent. It wasn't a lie, not manipulation, a habit, a reflex. She didn't know any other way. Dan looked at her. He asked if she was cold. Serafina blinked. Her tail twitched under the illusion. She said that succubi don't get cold. Dan took off his jacket. He draped it over her shoulders. He said it was just in case, and turned back to the fire. Serafina sat there. The jacket smelled of smoke and something warm. She didn't take it off until morning. Veldheim turned out to be bigger than Dan had expected. Walls of gray stone, a market in the main square, shops, taverns, lots of people, noisy. It smelled of manure and roasted meat and something sweet from the bakery. Dan walked down the street and saw this world for the first time, truly. Not a castle, not a forest, a city. People, ordinary people, merchants, artisans, children, guards at the gates, the priest of the Church of the Holy Flame on the corner, a woman hanging out laundry. The world was alive, real, not a page from a manga, not a game screen, alive. It hit Dan harder than he expected. He stopped in the middle of the street. Serafina turned around. She asked what was wrong. Dan said nothing was wrong. It was just beautiful. Serafina looked around, at the dirty street, at the drunk man by the tavern, at the puddle where a pig was rooting. She looked at Dan. For the first time since they'd met, she didn't know what to say. They found the alchemy shop, an old man behind the counter, gray-haired, hunched over, sharp eyes. Dan placed 3 mushrooms from the castle cellars on the counter. The old man looked at them. He picked one up, sniffed it. He looked at the light, put it back. His hands were shaking. He asked where they'd gotten them. Dan replied that they were on the estate grounds, in the cellars. They grow wild. The old man was silent. Then he named a price. Serafina, behind Dan's back, let out a barely audible sigh. The price was high, very high. 3 mushrooms cost as much as the average family in Veldheim earned in 6 months. Dan didn't show any surprise. He nodded. He said he had more, that he was ready to supply them regularly, that he needed a reliable buyer, not a one-time deal. The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he held out his hand. They sealed the deal with a handshake. Dan bought food, lots of it, grains, meat, vegetables, spices, oil, salt, cloth, thread, soap, candles. He bought methodically, according to a list he'd drawn up back at the castle. Serafina carried the sacks. She complained. She said she was a general's wife, not a pack mule. Dan silently took the heaviest bag from her. Serafina fell silent. She snatched the bag back, said she could manage on her own, and walked ahead, quickly, so he wouldn't see her face. At the tavern during lunch, Dan noticed something. 3 people at a corner table, identical cloaks, inconspicuous, gray, but 2 identical. They weren't eating, they weren't drinking, they were looking around. One of them was looking at Dan. Dan turned away, not abruptly, naturally. He picked up his mug. He drank slowly. Serafina sensed his mood. She leaned closer, playing a part, a wife whispering in her husband's ear. She asked what he saw. Dan answered quietly. 3 men, observers, not the order, others. Serafina narrowed her eyes. Her succubus senses flared for a second. She read them. She said they were afraid, not of him, of something else. They were looking for someone, not him specifically, but anyone who seemed suspicious. Church spies, the Inquisition of the Holy Flame. Dan finished his drink. He stood up. They left the tavern, calmly, without rushing. The way back was quieter. Serafina didn't talk. She was thinking. Halfway there, she said the city was more dangerous than she'd expected, that the church and the order were both watching, that ordinary trade wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Dan nodded. He knew, but there was no other way. The castle couldn't exist in isolation. It needed resources. Resources meant contact. Contact meant risk. It was like a coffee shop. You can't brew the perfect coffee if you don't open the door. And an open door lets everyone in, including those you don't expect. They returned on the 3rd day. Bran met them at the gate. She had been waiting. Dan realized she wasn't waiting for supplies. She was waiting for him. She sniffed the bags. Then she sniffed Dan. Then she sniffed Serafina. She frowned. She said Serafina smelled like Dan. Serafina rolled her eyes. She said they'd been on the road for 3 days, and that on the road, people smell like each other. Bran didn't look convinced, but Dan pulled a piece of jerky out of the bag and held it out to her. Bran took it, took a bite, forgot what she'd been thinking. In the kitchen, Dan cooked for 2 hours. A real dinner, with meat, with vegetables, with seasonings, with bread he'd bought at the Veldheim bakery. The aroma wafted through the castle. Lilith came down from the tower. Raina stepped out of her study. Serafina was already seated at the table. Bran stood by the door, sniffing the air with an expression of absolute bliss on her face. Dan set the food out, 6 plates. He placed one on an empty spot, just in case someone else came. A habit. There was always one extra chair in the coffee shop. They ate, in silence. Then not in silence. Bran said the meat was good. Serafina said the sauce could have been bolder. Rhaena said the bread was fresh. For Rhaena, that was a compliment. Lilith ate in silence, but she finished everything. And when Dan reached out to take her plate, she touched his fingers for a second. Accidentally. Or maybe not. The connection between them pulsed evenly and calmly, like a heartbeat. After dinner, Dan washed the dishes. Serafina stayed in the kitchen. She was sitting on the table, dangling her feet. Silent. This was new. Serafina being silent. Dan didn't ask. He washed the plates. She spoke up on her own, quietly, without her usual playful tone. She said that in the city, when he draped his jacket over her shoulders, it was the first time. Dan asked, "The first time what?" Serafina paused. Then she said it was the first time someone had given her something without expecting anything in return. Dan stopped washing the plate. He looked at her. Serafina didn't look back. She was staring at the wall, her tail wrapped around her waist. That same gesture. Dan went back to the plate. He said the jacket was too big for him anyway. Serafina snorted. She climbed down from the table. She left. She stopped at the door. Without turning around, she said goodnight. Her voice was normal, light, playful, but Dan could tell. His intuition told him she was sincere. For the first time, completely sincere. He finished washing the dishes. He put out the fire in the hearth. He went to bed. On the way, he stopped by Bran's room. The door was open. Bran was sitting on the bed. A book lay in front of her. She was looking at it the way one looks at a puzzle. She was frowning, moving her lips. Dan peeked in, asked what she was reading. Bran looked up. She said she was trying, that the letters were small and unruly. Dan went in, sat down next to her, looked at the book. It was an old volume on the history of the demonic wars. Heavy language, long sentences, not for beginners. He asked if she could read. Bran was silent. Then she said quietly that she couldn't, that orcs aren't taught letters. Orcs are taught the axe. Dan nodded. He stood up. He went to the library. He returned 10 minutes later with a thin book, a children's alphabet book. He found it on the bottom shelf, with pictures. He handed it to Bran. She took it. She looked at the pictures. On the first page was an animal that looked like a fox. Bran ran her finger over the drawing. Her finger was thicker than the whole drawing. She looked up at Dan. There was something vulnerable in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before behind the fangs and scars and the axe. Dan sat back down. He pointed to the first letter. He said it. Bran repeated it, loudly, hesitantly. He pointed to the second one. They sat there for an hour. By the end, Bran knew 10 letters. She was a quick learner, much faster than Dan had expected. When he stood up to leave, Bran grabbed his sleeve, gently. For a creature capable of bending iron with her bare hands, she asked if he would come tomorrow too. Dan said yes. Bran let go of his sleeve. She smiled. Dan went out. He closed the door. He leaned against the wall. He stood there for a minute. He thought about how Bran's axe weighed more than he did, and yet she was afraid to admit she couldn't read. He thought about how Serafina had been smiling for 1,000 years, but this was the first time she'd felt warm from someone else's jacket. He thought about how Rhaena plans 10 moves ahead, but doesn't know how to ask for tea when she wants it. He thought about Lilith, who had been silent for 1,000 years, and now didn't know how to start a conversation. 4 women, 4 kinds of loneliness. And he was in the middle. A guy from Portland, with an untied shoelace and the ability to make coffee. Dan chuckled quietly. He went to sleep. The 3rd week of the 2nd month began with D. Dan woke up to a scream. Not a battle cry, a domestic one. Serafina and Bran were standing in the hallway, yelling at each other. Bran was holding half a door in her hand. The other half was lying on the floor. Serafina was poking her tail toward the debris and saying that it was her door. Bran replied that the door was locked and she needed to get in. Serafina asked why. Bran said she wanted to ask where Dan was. Serafina asked why she needed Dan at 6 in the morning. Bran said he'd promised to teach her the alphabet. Serafina opened her mouth and closed it. She looked at the door debris, then at Bran. Then she rubbed her face with her palms and went to the kitchen. Dan fixed the door by lunchtime, the 5th one in 2 weeks. Bran didn't break things on purpose. She just didn't understand that doors were meant to be opened, not walked through. For an orc raised in a military camp, the concept of personal space was about as abstract as the concept of dessert. Rhaena proposed a solution. She drew up a schedule. Everyone was assigned specific hours and areas. The kitchen was Dan's from 6 to 8, Bran's from 8 to 10. The library during the day was Rhaena's. In the evening, it was everyone's. The training yard was Bran's at any time. The tower was Lilith's. The basements were Seraphina's. Dan looked at the schedule. Neat handwriting, clear lines. 23 items. He hung it on the kitchen wall. The system worked for 3 days. On the 4th day, Bran forgot about the schedule and walked into the library during Rhaena's hour. Rhaena froze her left boot to the floor. Bran ripped her leg out along with a chunk of the floor. Dan spent the rest of the evening repairing the floor. The problem wasn't the schedule. The problem was that 4 beings who had lived for hundreds of years in solitude or in the army didn't know how to live together. None of them knew how to give in, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. Dan decided to do things differently. Instead of rules, he started with rituals. Breakfast at 8, everyone at the table. No weapons. That was the first rule, and the only one he stated. Bran asked why no weapons. Dan replied that you don't fight over food. Bran thought about it. She nodded. She left her axe by the door. Seraphina asked if a tail counted as a weapon. Dan said no. Seraphina smirked. Rhaena didn't ask anything. She just came. Lilith came down from the tower, silently. The first 3 breakfasts passed in silence. Everyone ate. No one spoke. On the 4th day, Bran said she had learned a new letter. She pointed to the bread. She pressed a symbol into the crust with her finger. Seraphina said it wasn't the right letter. Bran said it was. Seraphina said it wasn't. Rhaena, without looking up from her plate, said that Bran was right. Seraphina looked at Rhaena. Rhaena looked at Seraphina. Something passed between them. Not ice, not heat. Just an acknowledgement. Small, insignificant, but the first. Dan drank his tea and pretended not to notice. By the end of the 1st month, the breakfast ritual had taken root. A week later, the evening tea ritual began. Dan brewed the tea. Lilith drank by the window. Seraphina sat at the table. Bran sat on the floor because the chairs broke under her. Rhaena sat in an armchair. No one spoke. But everyone came. Every evening. Without reminders. At the end of the 2nd month, what Dan had both hoped for and feared happened. The castle was attacked. Not by the Order. Mercenaries. 3 squads. From 3 sides, 40 men, well-armed, well-paid. Bran saw them first. She ran in from the training yard, an axe in her hand. Her eyes were burning. She was happy. Finally, an enemy. Lilith climbed onto the wall. She looked down. 3 groups, professionals, a mercenary guild, expensive gear. Someone had paid a lot of money. She turned to Dan, said she could wipe them out through the channel, all 40 of them, with a single spell. Dan stood beside her, looking down, seeing their faces, young, some no older than 18, skinny, tanned, not the elite, not fanatics, just people who'd been paid. He said no. Lilith looked at him, not surprised, tired. She asked again. Dan nodded, again. He said they didn't know what they were fighting for, that they'd simply been paid, that if they were killed, the Order, or whoever had hired them, would send more. But if they were fed, the employer would start having problems. Lilith asked what kind of problems. Dan answered, mercenaries fed by the enemy are mercenaries who ask questions. Mercenaries who ask questions are mercenaries who no longer obey. That's worse than losing a squad. That's losing your reputation. Rhaena stood behind them. She listened. She nodded slowly. She said it would work, if the execution is flawless. Dan laid out the plan. Lilith creates an invisible dome around the castle through the channel. Not a barrier, pressure, weight. The mercenaries must feel that moving forward is difficult but possible. They will slow down, lose formation. Rhaena guides them. Walls of ice. Not to kill, to separate. Corridors of ice leading into the castle courtyard. Like a cattle pen, only more elegant. Seraphina casts a spell. A light one. Fatigue. Hunger. the desire to sit down. Not mind control, just an amplification of what's already there. They've been walking for 3 days. They're tired. She'll just remind them of that. Bran disarms them, with her bare hands. Carefully. Dan repeated that word 3 times. Bran frowned, asked what carefully meant. Dan demonstrated, took her hand, placed an egg in it, said that every mercenary is an egg. Don't crush it. Bran looked at the egg, pressed her lips together, nodded, seriously, as if she'd received the most important order of her life. And Dan, meanwhile, would be making soup. Lilith turned to him, asked if he was really serious. Dan replied that he absolutely was. Lilith looked at him for 5 seconds. Then she closed her eyes. She shook her head and said, "Let's do this." The next 2 hours were the strangest battle in the history of Ayrton. The dome descended onto the field in front of the castle. The mercenaries slowed down. They stumbled. They lost their bearings. Icy walls rose from the ground, smooth, transparent, beautiful. Reyna worked like a sculptor. Every turn was precise. Every dead end led to the courtyard. Serafina sat on the wall and hummed softly. Her magic spread like fog. The mercenaries yawned. One sat right down on the grass, then a second, then 10. Bran walked among them. She took the swords from their weakened hands, carefully. She didn't break a single egg. 2 hours later, 40 disarmed mercenaries sat in the castle courtyard. Some were asleep. Some just sat on the ground, not understanding what had happened. Dan came out with a pot, a big one. The soup was simple: meat, vegetables, lots of salt, lots of heat. He began to serve it out. The first mercenary looked at the bowl in his hands, then at Dan, then back at the bowl, and began to eat. A minute later, everyone was eating. Some were crying, quietly, turning away. One boy, about 17, was eating so fast he burned himself. Dan sat down next to him. He told him not to rush. There were seconds. The boy looked up. There was something broken in his eyes. He said he hadn't eaten anything hot in a month, that the guild fed them crackers, that the commander took the best, that he didn't want to come here. Dan nodded. He poured him seconds. He asked what his name was. The boy answered, "Tom." Dan said, "It was nice to meet you, Tom." Lilith watched from the tower window. Reyna stood on the wall. Serafina sat on the roof, dangling her feet. Bran stood at the gate with an axe behind her back, making sure no one escaped, though no one wanted to run away. By morning, 20 mercenaries had asked to stay. Not to fight, just to stay. Some offered to work, repair the walls, carry stones, anything, for food. Dan accepted 12, the ones who were sincere. The detector worked flawlessly. He let the rest go, gave them food for the road, told them that if they changed their minds, they knew where to find him. The mercenary captain was the last to leave the gate. He stopped. He turned to Dan. Said he'd been paid to kill the archmage. Dan replied that he wasn't an archmage. The captain smirked, said he knew. An archmage doesn't cook soup, and he left. By evening, the castle had changed. 12 new people, former mercenaries. Dan assigned a room to each of them. He gave each one a job. He fed each one. The castle was no longer empty. It began to come alive. Voices, footsteps, the tapping of hammers. The sound Dan was used to hearing in the coffee shop. The sound of life. Lilith came downstairs in the evening. She stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the table where 17 people were sitting. 5 of her own. 12 new ones. Everyone was eating. Everyone was talking. Bran was telling a story about a wyvern. The mercenaries listened with their mouths agape. Serafina laughed. Reyna ate in silence, but the corner of her mouth was turned up a millimeter. Lilith stood in the doorway. Dan approached. He handed her a plate. She took it. She looked at him. She said quietly that in 1,000 years she had seen 1,000 battles. And this was the first one that ended with a dinner. Dan replied that the best battles always end with a dinner. Lilith entered. She sat down at the table. She began to eat. The channel between them pulsed, steadily, warmly. Like a heartbeat, the news spread quickly. Dan wasn't surprised. 40 mercenaries meant 40 tongues. The 28 who left told everyone. In the taverns of Veldheim, on the road, in the barony's capital. The story grew richer with details. Archmage von Aerten is invincible. He has 4 witches. The castle is surrounded by an invisible wall. Swords fall from their hands. Enemies fall asleep on the move. And then he feeds them. The last point confused people the most. An enemy who kills is understandable. An enemy who feeds them is something new. Reyna tracked the rumors through the merchants who began arriving at the castle. After the incident with the mercenaries, the first trade caravan arrived at the gates. 3 carts, fabrics and tools in exchange for alchemical mushrooms. A second one followed, then a third. By the end of the 3rd month, the castle had become a trading post, unofficial, but real. Reyna used this to her advantage. Every merchant carried information. She gathered it bit by bit. Who had hired the mercenaries? How the order was reacting? What the church was saying. The picture was coming together. The order received a report from the surviving mercenaries. The wording was such that when Reyna heard it, she smiled. For the first time, in front of everyone, the mercenaries reported that Archmage von Aerten possessed unprecedented power and unconventional tactics. The recommendation was not to attack again without serious preparation. The Church of the Holy Flame reacted more quietly, more anxiously. For them, any power not sanctified by the flame was heresy. But the church could not attack a noble house directly. It needed a pretext. Dan listened to Reyna's reports over evening tea. He nodded. He asked questions. How many combat archbishops were in the nearest region? What was the procedure for accusing a noble of heresy? Were there any precedents? Reyna answered, in detail. With each passing day, her reports grew longer. Not because there was more information, but because she had begun to enjoy these conversations. Someone was listening. Someone valued her mind, not as a tool, as a conversation partner. At the same time, Dan was mastering the channel. Every day, Lilith taught him. In the morning, in the Hall of Seals, she would form a spell. He would channel it through himself. At first, it was like drinking water from a fire hose. Too much power, too little control. He would light torches and melt the walls. He would create a shield and get thrown back 10 meters. He tried to heat a stone and nearly melted the foundation. Lilith was patient. In her own way. She didn't praise him. She didn't comfort him. She just repeated, again, more. Not like that. Softer. You're the conduit, not the source. Don't push, let it pass. By the end of the 3rd month, Dan had learned to control the flow. Not perfectly, but passably. He could light a fire without melting the wall. He could create a shield and hold it for 10 seconds. He could heat water without boiling it instantly. Small victories. But each one meant the channel was working, that the connection was growing stronger. Lilith could feel it. Dan could see it in her eyes. Something was changing, slowly. She started coming down from the tower more often. Not just for breakfast and dinner. Sometimes she'd just sit in the kitchen while he cooked, silent, reading, or not reading. She was just there. One evening, Dan found an old book in the library. Recipes, ancient ones. Some of the dishes were 1,000 years old. He flipped through the pages. He couldn't read everything, but the pictures were clear. One dish caught his eye. Something like a pie filled with dark berries. The illustration was detailed, beautiful. Next to the drawing was a note in the margins, in different handwriting, old, faded. Dan took the book to Reyna. He asked her to translate the note. Reyna took it. She read it. She fell silent. Then she said quietly that the note was written in ancient demonic, that it was a personal note. Someone had written that this pie was her younger brother's favorite, that she needed to remember the recipe because he always asked for seconds. Dan asked whose handwriting it was. Reyna looked at him. She replied that it was Lilith's handwriting. Dan took the book. The next day, he spent 2 hours looking for the ingredients. He found the berries in the forest. Bran helped. She knew the plants better than anyone. He had flour. He had butter. He cooked all day. 3 attempts. The first one burned. The second one fell apart. The third one turned out. Not perfect, but it looked like the drawing. He set the plate on the table, 1 serving, in front of Lilith's seat. Lilith came down for dinner. She sat down. She saw the plate. She froze. She stared at the pie for a long time. Her face didn't change, but her hands on the table trembled. She looked up at Dan. He saw something in them that made his chest ache. Not his pain, hers. 1,000 years of loneliness compressed into a single glance. She asked quietly how he knew. Dan replied that he'd found the recipe in a book. With a note in the margins, Lilith lowered her eyes. She stared at her plate for a long time. The whole table was silent. Serafina froze with her fork. Raina didn't move. Bran stopped chewing. Lilith picked up a spoon. She tasted it, chewed slowly, put down the spoon, quietly said one word, "Thank you." At that moment, the channel between them flared up. Dan felt it physically, like a gust of warm wind from within. The castle walls hummed. The runes on the ceiling, which hadn't glowed in 1,000 years, flared with soft gold for 3 seconds, and went out. Everyone at the table felt it. Serafina shuddered. Raina sat up straight. Bran placed a hand over her heart. Lilith sat with her eyes closed. There were no tears on her face, but Dan knew. He could feel it through the connection. Inside her was a sea. After dinner, Dan washed the dishes, alone. As always, Lilith didn't go up to the tower. She stood by the kitchen window, staring into the darkness. Without turning around, she said his name was Aaron, her brother. He was 200 years younger. He laughed loudly. He always asked for seconds of that pie. He died a year before the sealing, defending the border from the creatures of the abyss. She couldn't save him. Dan stopped washing the plate. He stood there, listening. Lilith spoke quietly, evenly, as if telling someone else's story. But the channel didn't lie. Every word was a wound. She fell silent. Dan didn't say anything comforting. He didn't say he understood. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand 1,000 years of loneliness. He simply said that tomorrow he'd try to do better. That the first attempt is never perfect, but he'd try. Lilith turned. She looked at him, and for the first time since they'd met, her lips twitched into something that was almost a smile. A real one, not a shadow, not a ghost. Almost real. She left. Dan finished washing the dishes. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something else. Something he couldn't name yet. The contract was extended for a 4th month. Not because Dan had asked. He wouldn't have asked. It just happened. Bran was the first. She approached him in the courtyard that morning, serious, no smile, an axe on her back, a yellow scarf around her neck. Dan had knitted it a week ago. He'd found a book on knitting in the library. He'd studied for 3 nights. The scarf turned out crooked, uneven. Bran wore it without taking it off. She stood in front of him. She said she wanted to enter into the agreement. Dan asked why. Bran thought for a long time. Then she said, because he'd asked what her favorite color was, because no one had ever asked her that before, because he's teaching her the alphabet, because he knitted her a scarf, because when she broke the 5th door, he didn't yell, he just fixed it. She said she didn't know what love was, but if it's when you want someone to be by your side, to eat, and to be warm, then yes, that's it. Dan stood there. He was silent. Then he said quietly that he wasn't sure he knew either, but that it seemed to him she had described it better than anyone. Bran accepted the contract easily, as if she had been waiting for it. Dan felt her through the channel. Power, fire, heat, like standing next to a blacksmith's forge. And beneath it all, something soft, warm, vulnerable, like a yellow field in autumn. The second was Serafina. She came at night, knocked. Dan opened the door. She stood in the hallway. No illusions, no makeup, hair tousled. Lilith's robe, which she'd snatched a week ago and hadn't returned. She looked small, ordinary, not at all like the generaless of pleasure and dreams. She said she wanted to enter into the contract. Dan asked why. Serafina was silent, her tail wrapped around her waist. Then she said, because in the morning, when she walks into the kitchen, he pours her coffee. Not that coffee, the local version that Dan learned to make from roasted beans of some local variety. But he pours it with the same expression, every day, without expectation, without hidden meaning. She said that her whole life she had been valued for what she evoked in others. Desire, passion, hunger. And Dan looks at her and sees a girl who needs breakfast. And that's scarier than any battle, because you can run away from a battle, but not from kindness. The deal was made with Serafina. Dan felt her. a warmth of a different kind, softer, deeper, like silk on the skin. And beneath it all, a loneliness so deep that Dan's chest tightened. The third was Raina. She didn't come. She invited Dan into her office, at the table, officially, with a document she had drawn up, an agreement to enter into a marital contract. 12 clauses, the silver frost seal. Dan read it, slowly. Raina waited, back straight. Her face was stony. He finished reading, looked at her, asked why there were 12 points. Raina replied that legal clarity was necessary, that emotions were unreliable, that the document protected both parties. Dan put the document on the table, said he wouldn't sign it. Raina flinched, barely noticeably, by a millimeter, but Dan saw it. He said he would sign if she told him the real reason, not a political one, not a strategic one, the real one. Raina was silent for a long time, a minute, two. Her fingers on the table clenched into fists, then unclenched. She spoke, quietly, without her usual icy tone. She said that 3 weeks ago he had restored the grove with winter birds in the castle courtyard, that she recognized those birds, silver jays. They used to nest in the garden of the Silverfrost house when she was a child. She'd mentioned them once, in passing, over dinner, and he remembered, and found them, and planted the trees, and he attracted the birds with the help of Serafina and a local mage who used to be a mercenary, just like that, without any gain, without any calculation. She said she stood alone in that grove, listening to the birds sing, and for the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to cry, not quietly, not restrainedly, out loud, because the sound of those birds was the sound of home, a home that no longer existed, and she realized that Dan hadn't given her back the grove. He had given her back the right to feel, the right to be a human being, not a strategist, if only for a moment. Dan took the document, tore it up. Raina opened her mouth. Dan held out his hand. He said the contract didn't need to be on paper. Raina looked at his hand. 10 seconds. Then she took it. Her fingers were icy. The channel flared, cold, pure, sharp, like winter air in the mountains, and beneath it, warmth, hidden so deep it seemed non-existent, but it was there. Lilith wasn't entering the contract anew. She was already in it, from the very beginning. But that evening, when all 4 channels were active at once, Dan felt them together for the first time. 4 streams: Bran's fire, Serafina's silk, Raina's ice, and Lilith. Lilith was like an ocean, deep, dark, endless, with currents he couldn't understand, with depths he couldn't peer into. But on the surface of this ocean, for the first time in 1,000 years, there was a ripple. Small, warm, like a stone thrown by a kind, clumsy guy from Portland. The 5 of them sat at dinner. The channel between them hummed. The castle walls vibrated. The runes on the ceiling flickered. Bran was eating his 3rd helping. Serafina was laughing. Raina was pretending not to smile. Lilith was drinking tea. Dan sat at the head of the table and thought that a week ago he couldn't light a candle without melting the wall. And now, the power of 4 ancient beings, and he felt each of them like his own heartbeat. Then he thought the porridge was burning. He stood up. He went to the hearth. Lilith watched him go. Serafina watched him go. Raina watched him go. Bran watched him go and reached for some bread. A normal evening in a castle at the edge of the world. In the 5th month, Ivy arrived. She didn't actually come. She snuck in. A small, skinny, red-headed girl with a sack of herbs on her back and a knife in her sleeve slipped through a hole in the wall that Bran had punched on the first day and that Dan still hadn't patched up. Bran found her in the pantry. Ivy was stuffing her bag with mushrooms, those very alchemical ones. Bran grabbed her by the scruff of the neck with one hand. She lifted her up. Ivy hung in the air and hissed like a wet cat. The knife fell out of her sleeve and clattered to the floor. Bran brought her into the kitchen. She set her down in front of Dan. She said she'd caught a thief. She asked what to do with her. Dan looked at Ivy, small, about 17, but she looks 13, skinny to the point of transparency, red hair, dirty and tangled, freckles on her nose. Green eyes, angry, very angry, and very hungry. Dan thanked Bran, asked her to let her go. Bran let her go. Ivy landed on her feet. She crouched down, ready to run. Dan turned toward the hearth. He poured a bowl of soup, set it on the table, sat down across from her. He waited. Ivy stood there. She looked at the soup, then at Dan, then at the door, then back at the soup. The soup won. She sat down. She ate quickly, greedily, burning herself, choking. Dan didn't rush her, he didn't ask questions, he just sat there. When the bowl was empty, he poured a second one. Ivy ate the second one more slowly. By the third, she wasn't in a hurry anymore. She put down her spoon, wiped her mouth on her sleeve, looked at Dan, said she wasn't going to work it off, that she wasn't a slave, that if he thought she'd do whatever he said for a bowl of soup, he could forget it. Dan replied that the soup was free. Ivy frowned. She said there's no such thing as free. Dan replied that there is, right now. Ivy was silent for a minute. Then she asked if she could stay the night. Just one night. She'd leave in the morning. Dan said she could. He showed her the room, a small one, next to the kitchen, warm. He made the bed. Ivy stood in the doorway and looked at the bed as if she were seeing a bed for the first time in her life. Maybe she was. Dan said goodnight. He left. In the morning, Ivy didn't leave, nor the next morning, nor a week later. She didn't say she was staying. She just didn't leave. She'd disappear during the day. She'd come back for dinner. She ate in silence. She looked down at the floor. She didn't trust anyone, but she came every evening. Serafina was the first to start talking to her. Succubi sense people. Serafina saw something in Ivy that the others didn't notice. Not anger, fear. A deep, long-standing fear of loneliness. Serafina didn't pry. She didn't impose herself. She just sat down next to her at dinner. She chatted about nonsense. Ivy listened. She didn't answer, but she listened. After 2 weeks, Ivy spoke up on her own. To Bran, not to the humans, to the orc. Because Bran was the only one who didn't look at her with pity. Bran looked at everyone the same way, as if they were food or a comrade. There was no third option. That suited Ivy. She asked Bran why she wore a yellow scarf in battle. Bran replied that Dan had tied it. Ivy asked why. Bran thought for a moment. Then she said it was because he'd asked what her favorite color was. Ivy was silent. Then she said quietly that she didn't have a favorite color. Bran looked at her. Seriously? Lee. She said she should think about it. There was time. A month later, Ivy knew everyone. She both feared and admired Lilith. She respected Reyna because Reyna was the only one who spoke to her like an adult. She tolerated Serafina because Serafina didn't take offense at her rudeness. She loved Bran. She didn't say it, but she followed her around. She watched her train. Once she asked to hold the axe. The axe turned out to be heavier than Ivy. Bran carefully helped her lower it. She didn't laugh. Dan watched. He didn't interfere. He didn't ask Ivy about her past. He didn't demand gratitude. He just left breakfast on the table every morning. Every evening he put her plate back in its place. Every night he checked to see if the candle was lit in her room. He taught her the same way Bran taught her the alphabet. No pressure, no schedule. Ivy was literate. She read fluently. She could count faster than Dan. She was smart, sharp, a tongue like a razor. Dan taught her something else. To wash her mug after herself. To make her bed, to say thank you. Not because those were the rules, but because when you take care of your things, you take care of yourself. Ivy resisted. She snapped back, said she didn't need a father, that she was on her own, that she'd leave tomorrow. Dan nodded, said, "All right," and put the plate back in its place. At the end of her second month living in the castle, a morning came that changed everything. Dan was standing in the kitchen, making breakfast. Ivy walked in, sleepy, her hair sticking out in all directions. She rubbed her eyes. Dan set a mug in front of her. Hot. A plate. Porridge with berries, the very ones from the forest. Ivy sat down. She picked up a spoon. She ate in silence. She finished the mug. She stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. Without turning around, she quietly said one word, "Bye," and ran off. Quickly, Dan stood there with the mug in his hand. He didn't move. Something shifted somewhere in his chest, like a mechanism that had rusted and suddenly turned. He set the mug down, sat there for a minute, then stood up, went to her room. The door was closed. He didn't knock. He just set the plate with seconds on the floor by the door and left. Ivy didn't come out until evening. The plate was gone by dinner time. That evening she came to dinner. She sat in her usual spot. She didn't look at Dan. She ate in silence. Everything was as usual, but under the table, her foot brushed against the leg of his chair. Just a little, like an anchor. The 4 women at the table saw everything. They'd heard about it that morning. Serafina had told the others. No one discussed it in front of Ivy. But that evening, Lilith looked at Dan, and there was something final in her eyes, something resolved, as if the last question she'd been unable to answer for 1,000 years had finally been answered. The channel hummed quietly, steadily, not from force, from something else. Something Dan didn't know the name of in this language, in any language. The 6th month brought war. Not the one Dan had expected, not mercenaries, not the Order. The Church of the Holy Flame. 3 combat archbishops, each with a detachment of 20 holy warriors, 63 men in white armor with the symbol of a flame on their shields. They had set up camp 2 hours' march from the castle. They didn't attack, they waited. Reyna brought the news over evening tea. Her voice was steady, but Dan felt a chill through the channel, a real cold. Reyna was afraid. She explained, "The combat archbishops are not mercenaries. They are high-ranking clergy trained to slay demons. Each of their divine blessings exceeds 4,000 points. They possess holy weapons, holy shields, prayers capable of dispelling demonic magic. Soup won't help against them." Dan nodded. He asked what they were waiting for. Reyna replied that they were waiting for a reason. The church cannot attack a noble house without a charge of heresy. They need proof that demons live in the castle. Any proof. Bran stepping outside the walls. A display of demonic magic. A single, careless move. They're waiting for a mistake. Lilith stood by the window, silent. Dan sensed her through the channel. Not fear, anger. Millennia old. Deep. The church had taught people to hate demons for 1,000 years. Using her name, her story, turning her sacrifice into proof that all demons are evil. Lilith wanted to go out and burn their camp. Every tent, every shield. Dan felt that desire through the channel, scorching. He said no. Lilith turned. Her eyes were dark, almost black. She asked why. Again, why? Dan answered, because if she burned 3 squads, the church would send 30, and after 30, the crusade would come, and then it wouldn't matter how strong she was. War would destroy everything. The castle, the trade, the people who had come to them, the 12 former mercenaries, Ivy, everything. Lilith was silent. The channel between them hummed, tense, on the edge. Dan moved closer. He said quietly that he knew that she was tired of enduring. 1,000 years of enduring, but one more day, one. He'd figure it out. Lilith looked at him for a long time. Then the channel flickered. The heat receded. She nodded. One day. Dan hadn't slept all night. He sat in the kitchen, thinking, drinking tea, drawing diagrams on paper. Reyna sat across from him. She hadn't slept either. They discussed, quietly, option after option. Attack, no. Defense, no. Flight, no. Diplomacy. Reyna shook her head. She said the church doesn't negotiate with those it suspects of heresy. Dan asked about the nobles. Reyna paused. She looked at him. He explained. The church cannot attack without an accusation. An accusation requires evidence. If there is no evidence, then the church stands beneath the walls of a noble's house without cause, and that is an insult to the family. Noble law allows for a complaint to be filed with the royal court. The royal court is obligated to hear the case. While the court is considering the case, the church has no right to act. Reyna listened. Her eyes changed from cold to sharp. She said it would take months. That by the time the court decides, the church might find another way. Dan agreed, but months is time, and time is a resource. Reyna nodded, slowly. She said she needed to write a complaint, right now. A perfect one, flawless, in legal language so precise that the royal court wouldn't be able to reject it. She wrote until dawn. Dan read. He didn't understand half the words, but he understood the structure, the logic. Every sentence like a brick in a wall, every argument like a keystone. Reyna was a genius, not in battle, in this, in words, in systems, in rules that could be used as weapons. In the morning, Dan went out to the church camp, alone again. Bran was growling. Serafina was cursing. Lilith was silent. Reyna handed him a scroll and told him not to improvise. Dan walked along the path. His heart was pounding. His hands were cold. Ahead, the tents glowed white. The holy symbols on the flags shone with a soft golden light. Beautiful, unnerving. The first archbishop met him at the edge of the camp, an old man, about 60 years old, a white beard, white armor, eyes like coals. He looked down at Dan, asked who he was. Dan introduced himself. Daniel von Ayrton, head of the house. The archbishop narrowed his eyes, said that the church had received reports of demonic activity in this area, that holy duty required an investigation. Dan nodded, held out the scroll. He said it was a complaint to the royal court of the barony of Veldmar. The house of von Ayrton accuses the Church of the Holy Flame of violating the noble right to the inviolability of estates. The archbishop took the scroll. He read it. His face changed, slowly. Surprise gave way to irritation. Irritation gave way to something resembling respect. He looked up. He said that the complaint would not stop the investigation. Dan replied that it would not stop it, but it would slow it down. And while the court deliberates, the House of von Ayrton invites one representative of the church to visit the estate for an inspection. 1. Unarmed. For 1 day. Under noble law, the estate owner may voluntarily allow an inspection. And if the inspection find anything reprehensible, the church is obliged to drop the charges. The archbishop was silent. He was thinking. 2 of his colleagues approached. The 3 of them conferred. Dan stood and waited. His legs weren't shaking. Not because he wasn't afraid, because through the channel he could feel the 4 women standing on the castle wall, watching his back. Their strength flowed through him, not magic, just their presence, faith. The archbishops agreed. 1 inspector, tomorrow. Dan bowed. He left. On the way to the castle, he threw up in the bushes. Nerves. Everyone was waiting for him in the kitchen. Lilith asked what to do next. Dan replied that an inspector from the church would be coming to see them tomorrow. 1 person. They needed to hide everything demonic. All the runes, all the traces, all the horns. Serafina said she would conceal it with an illusion. Dan shook his head. He said that church inspectors could see through illusions. They had holy vision. Serafina frowned. She asked what to do then. Dan looked at Lilith, at her horns, small, neat, the ones she'd never hidden. He quietly asked if they could be physically concealed. Lilith was silent. Then she said she could change her form, not for long, for a few hours, to become completely human in appearance. It hurts, but it's possible. Dan said not to, that he'd find another way. Lilith shook her head, said there was no other way. Bran couldn't be hidden either. Green skin and fangs can't be concealed with a scarf. Serafina, without the illusion, has pink eyes and a tail. Reyna is the only one who can pass for a human. Dan sat there, thinking. Then Ivy coughed from the corner. Everyone turned around. She was standing by the door, arms crossed. She said there was makeup in town, theatrical makeup. Actors use it for performances, not magical, just regular paint and wax. Holy sight won't see what isn't there. It'll only see the paint, because paint is paint, not magic. Reyna looked at Ivy, slowly, with a new expression. She said the girl was right. Dan looked at Ivy. Ivy shrugged. She said she used to live on the streets. That's where you learn to hide without magic. Dan smiled. He thanked Ivy. Ivy turned away. But Dan saw that the tips of her ears had turned red. Serafina was sent to Veldheim for makeup. She returned by evening. 3 boxes, paint, wax, brushes. For the next 6 hours, Dan, Serafina, and Ivy worked. Lilith's horns were concealed with wax and flesh-colored paint, carefully. Not perfectly, but a casual glance, it was unnoticeable. Bran's skin was covered with foundation, 3 layers. Bran sat motionless. For a creature who couldn't sit still for a minute, it was a feat. Serafina's tail was wrapped in fabric and hidden under a long dress. Her eyes were concealed by dark glasses that Reyna found in the library. Antique, with tinted lenses, for reading in bright light. By morning they all looked like people. Strange, unusual, but people. Dan examined each one, checked the makeup, checked the clothes, ran his finger over the wax on Lilith's horns. She stood motionless. His hand was an inch from her face. He could feel her breath. The channel hummed softly. He said everything was fine, that it was holding. Lilith opened her eyes. Without the horns, she looked different. Younger, more vulnerable. Just a beautiful woman with dark hair and pomegranate-colored eyes. She said quietly that it was humiliating to hide who she was. Dan replied quietly, said he knew, that it was temporary, that one day she wouldn't have to hide. He promised. Lilith looked at him, then she nodded almost imperceptibly. The inspector arrived around noon. The inspector turned out to be young, about 25, thin, pale, dark circles under his eyes, a white cassock, a silver symbol of a flame on his chest. He walked through the gate and stopped. He looked around the courtyard, the walls, people. 12 former mercenaries were working as usual, carrying stones, repairing the wall. One was planing boards, the usual scene at an ordinary estate. The inspector introduced himself, Brother Thomas, junior investigator of the Holy Flame. Dan noted that the archbishops had sent a junior, not a senior, not an equal, a junior. That meant one of two things. Either they didn't take the inspection seriously, or they didn't care about this guy. Dan invited him inside, showed in the castle. Room after room, the kitchen, library, living quarters, training yard. Brother Thomas walked in silence. He looked. His eyes glowed with a soft golden light. Holy vision. He scanned every wall, every stone, every person. Dan felt it through the channel, a gentle pressure, like the sun peering through a cloud. Warm, persistent, searching. Lilith was standing in the library when they entered, dark hair, a dress, the wax on the horns held. She looked like a noblewoman, stern, beautiful, human. Brother Thomas looked at her, his holy vision slid over her. Dan stopped breathing. A second, 2, 3. Brother Thomas looked away. Nothing. The wax was wax, the paint was paint. His holy vision saw through magic, but against theatrical makeup it was powerless. Because the makeup wasn't lying, it was simply covering up. Like a curtain covers a window. The window is still there, but you can't see it. They walked through the entire castle. Bran stood in the courtyard, foundation on her skin, hair tucked under a helmet. In armor, she looked like a very large human warrior. Brother Thomas looked at her. Bran looked at him. He looked away first. Serafina was sitting in the library, dark glasses, a long dress, her tail tied to her leg. She was smiling, gently, not like a succubus, like a human. Brother Thomas nodded to her, walked past. Raina met him in the office, introduced herself as an advisor to the House of von Erten. White hair and blue eyes were unusual, but not demonic. She showed him documents, charters, trade agreements, invoices. Everything was neat, everything was flawless. Raina had been building this paper fortress for 3 months. Every document was genuine, every signature was legal. Brother Thomas read. He nodded. His golden eyes dimmed. His holy vision shut down. He stopped searching. By lunchtime, the inspection was over. Dan invited Brother Thomas into the kitchen. He fed him. Soup, bread, tea. Brother Thomas ate greedily, quickly, just as the mercenaries had eaten 2 months ago, just like Ivy had eaten. Dan watched him and thought that the church apparently fed its people just as poorly as the mercenary guilds. Brother Thomas finished eating. He put down his spoon. He was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, quietly, not like an inspector, like a human being. He said he'd been ordered to find demons. That Archbishop Marin had said this was a nest of evil, that holy duty demanded purification, that if he didn't find proof, they'd send him back and replace him with someone less squeamish. Dan listened, didn't interrupt. The detector was working. Brother Thomas wasn't lying. He was scared, not of the castle, of his own kind. Dan asked what would be in his report. Brother Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he said the report would contain the truth, that he had found no demonic activity, that the von Erten house was a legitimate noble estate, that the accusations had not been confirmed. Dan nodded. He thanked him. Brother Thomas stood. He walked to the door. He paused. He said that Archbishop Marin wouldn't stop, that the report would slow him down but not stop him, that Dan needed to be ready. Dan replied that he would be. Brother Thomas left. Dan stood in the doorway and watched as the white cassock disappeared down the path. Then he closed the door. Everyone was waiting for him in the kitchen. He said the inspection had gone well. Bran was the first to rip off her helmet. She shook her head. Her foundation had smudged. She rubbed her face in disgust. Serafina took off her glasses. Her tail slipped out from under her dress and unfurled to its full length. She groaned with relief. Rhaena hadn't changed. She looked like a human anyway. Lilith stood motionless. Dan approached. He carefully removed the wax from her left horn, then from the right. Small, curved horns emerged from beneath the makeup. Lilith stood and didn't move. His fingers were close to her face, very close. He worked carefully. He removed the wax bit by bit, so it wouldn't hurt. Lilith closed her eyes. When he finished, she opened them. She looked at him. She said quietly that she didn't have to hide alone, that this was different. Dan didn't understand. He asked what was different. Lilith answered. For 1,000 years she had hidden alone, behind the seals, in the darkness. Today she had hidden too, but there were people nearby who were hiding with her, and that was a completely different feeling. Dan nodded. He said he understood. Lilith tilted her head slightly. She asked if it was true. Dan replied that it wasn't, not completely. But he was trying. Lilith looked at him and smiled. Not a shadow, not a ghost. A smile, a real one. The first in 1,000 years. Small, quiet, but real. The channel between them flared so brightly that the walls hummed. Serafina gasped. Bran grabbed the table. Rhaena straightened up. Ivy in the corner pressed her hand to her chest. Dan stood there and felt. The ocean. An endless ocean of power. Lilith. All of her. Without walls. Without a bottom. For the first time, she wasn't holding back. For the first time, she let him feel the scale of it. And Dan understood. Truly understood. She wasn't just strong. She was an element, a continent, the sky, the ocean. All of it was her. And she had entrusted it to him, a guy from Portland, with an untied shoelace. The moment passed. Lilith closed herself off, gently, like the ebb of the tide. The channel returned to its usual hum. But Dan remembered. For the rest of his life. By the end of the 6th month, Dan learned the truth about his transfer. Not from Lilith, from Rhaena. Rhaena had found records in the library, ancient ones, sealed with magic that had weakened along with the seals. Scrolls containing the personal notes of the creators of the 7 seals. She spent 3 weeks translating them, in silence. She didn't tell anyone, not until she was sure. Then she came to Dan, in the morning, to the kitchen. She placed a stack of translated pages in front of him. She said he needed to read it. Dan read, slowly. Rhaena had translated it into simple language, but the content was complex. The seals were not created by the great hero. That was a lie. The church knew the truth and had hidden it for 1,000 years. Lilith created the seals, by herself, voluntarily. 1,000 years ago, she awakened something in the depths of the world. The abyss, the primordial essence, a void that devours all life. Lilith couldn't stop it. The abyss grew. It devoured lands. It killed peoples. The only way to stop it was to seal it along with its vessel. Lilith became the vessel. She accepted the abyss into herself. And she asked her husband to create seals that would lock them both away. The great hero, her first husband by contract. He did not defeat Lilith. He helped her. Together they devised the seals. Together they performed the ritual. He entered the seal with her. To hold back the abyss with his presence, with his love. 200 years later, he died. Man is not eternal. Lilith spent 800 years alone, holding back the abyss with her own will, in the darkness, in silence. 800 years. Dan laid the sheets on the table. His hands weren't shaking. Something inside was trembling. He asked about the stone, that stone in the Portland Museum. Rhaena nodded. A fragment of the first seal. Somehow it had found its way into his world. Lilith was calling through it, not consciously, on the level of a magical resonance frequency, calling for someone who would be kind, not strong, not a hero, kind. Dan asked about the Dan effect, about his bad luck. Rhaena paused. Then she said quietly that, yes, it was a side effect of the call, a long-standing distortion of fate. Signs fell, cars got ticketed, the lottery cheated, all so that at the right moment he would find himself at the right stone. His whole life, every failure, every random turn, everything led here. Dan sat in the kitchen, quietly, for a minute, 2, 5. Then he started laughing, quietly, then louder, then he stopped and cried. Not from grief, not from joy. From something in between. 23 years of bad luck. 23 years of thinking that's just how the world works, that he'd been unlucky in life. But in reality, he'd been led by a 1,000-year-old woman locked in darkness, who called not for a warrior, but for a good man. He laughed and cried at the same time, sitting on the kitchen floor of a castle at the edge of the world. Lilith entered. She knew. She sensed it through the channel. She sat down next to him, on the floor, next to him, silently. She took his hand. Her hand was warm, warm for the first time. Not hot from magic, just warm, human. She quietly said 2 words. "Forgive me." Dan squeezed her hand. He said it was nothing, that she had found him, and he thanked her for that. Lilith was silent. She held his hand. For a long time. The channel between them hummed softly. Not from power, from something simpler, something more important. Raina stood in the doorway. She watched. She left quietly. The 2 of them remained in the kitchen, a man and a demoness, on the floor, holding hands, like children who had found each other in the dark. That evening, Dan was calm. He came out for dinner. He cooked as usual. 17 servings, 5 for himself, 12 for the mercenaries. Ivy helped. She chopped vegetables, silently. She knew something had happened, but she didn't ask. She had learned not to ask. She was just there. After dinner, Dan went out onto the castle wall, alone. He looked at the horizon, the distant mountains, the forest, the sky, the stars that looked like Earths, but were arranged differently. He thought about the abyss, about how it was locked inside Lilith, about how when all 7 seals fall, the abyss will come out too, about how Lilith plans to seal herself away again, to go back into the darkness, alone. He knew it. He felt it through the channel. Not thoughts, intention, deep, ancient, decided long before he arrived. Lilith was going to sacrifice herself, again. Dan stood on the wall and looked at the stars, and quietly spoke 1 sentence aloud. No, not this time. The wind carried his words away, but the channel conveyed them. Somewhere in the tower, Lilith opened her eyes. Cassius Vale arrived at the beginning of the 7th month, not with an army, alone, on horseback. The Order's silver cloak, silver armor, the sword at his belt glowed with a dim, holy fire. Bran saw him first. She growled, axe already in hand. Dan stopped her. He stepped out. Cassius dismounted at the gate, tall, fair-haired, a face as if carved from marble, handsome, cold, eyes gray, empty. He looked down at Dan. Dan was half a head shorter. Cassius introduced himself. The Grand Inquisitor of the Order of the Silver Dawn, a collateral descendant of the great hero. He said it with pride, like a title. Dan sensed it through the detector. Not a lie, but not the truth either. Every word had been rehearsed, every gesture calculated. This man had worn a mask for so long that he had forgotten his own face. Cassius entered the castle. Dan couldn't refuse. The Grand Inquisitor had the right to enter any estate without an invitation. The law on the demonic threat, above noble law. Raina had warned him. She stood in the hallway. Her face was stony, but Dan could feel her fear through the channel. Sharp, icy. Raina knew who Cassius was, knew what he had done, knew he was capable of seeing what Brother Thomas had not. Cassius walked through the castle slowly. His holy vision burned brighter than Brother Thomas's, much brighter. The golden light from his eyes left traces on the walls. He scanned deeply, down to the very stone, down to the very roots. He found runes on the ceiling of the Hall of Seals, faded, but visible to one who knows what to look for. He stopped, looked at Dan, asked what it was. Dan answered, "An ancient protective system for the estate, ancestral magic, inactive since the inheritance." Cassius smiled, subtle, like a blade. He said he knew what ancestral magic was, and that this wasn't it. Dan was silent. Cassius continued. He spoke calmly, quietly, like a man who knows he's won and can take his time. He said he knew the truth, part of the truth, that the first seal had been broken, that Lilith was free, that somewhere in this castle lurks a creature that has kept the world in fear for 1,000 years, and that Dan is somehow bound to her by a contract. Dan stood there, his face calm, a storm raging inside. Through the channel, he sensed the 4 women: Lilith in the tower, cold fury; Seraphina in the library, fear; Reyna in the hallway, calculation; Bran in the courtyard, pure readiness for battle. Cassius stepped closer. He said that his ancestor had made a mistake. Sealed Lilith away instead of destroying her, that he would correct this mistake, that he possessed an ancient ritual, a way to wrest Lilith's power and absorb it, to become what his ancestor had failed to become, the new great hero, a god king. He said this while looking Dan in the eyes, without a threat, without malice, with absolute confidence, like a man reading a point from a plan. Dan listened. The detector was working. Every word was true. Cassius believed what he was saying, truly, without a shadow of a doubt. It was scarier than a lie. Cassius asked if Dan would interfere. Dan answered yes. Cassius nodded, said that was what he expected, and that it was a shame. He turned toward the exit, stopped at the door. Without turning around, he said he'd be back, not alone, and that next time, soup wouldn't help. He left. Dan stood in the hall, alone. His legs held him up, his hands didn't shake, but inside he felt empty, like after a gunshot. Cassius wasn't bluffing. He'd come, with an army, with a ritual, with everything. In the kitchen, Dan gathered everyone. He told them everything, word for word. Bran slammed her fist on the table. The table split in half. Seraphina turned pale. Reyna closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, there was ice in her eyes, pure, dangerous. Lilith was silent. Ivy sat in the corner, quiet, small, frightened. Dan looked at each of them. Then he said they had time. Not much, but they had some. Reyna asked how much. Dan replied that Cassius would bring an elite squad of inquisitors. They weren't mercenaries. You couldn't bribe them. You can't fool them with paper. We need a different strategy. Reyna nodded. She said she would start preparing the defenses. Bran said she would start training the former mercenaries. Seraphina said she would strengthen the protective spells through the channel. Lilith was silent. Dan looked at her. She was staring at the wall. Through the channel, he could sense what she was thinking. About the seal, about locking herself back inside, leaving, before Cassius arrived, to save the others. Dan walked over, sat down next to her, quietly said no. Lilith turned. Her eyes were dark. She asked how he knew. Dan replied that it was the channel, that he could sense her intentions, that he knew what she was thinking. Lilith turned away, said it was a logical decision. If she went back into the seal, Cassius would have no reason to attack. The castle would be safe. Everyone would be safe. Dan said everyone except her. Lilith was silent. Dan said he wouldn't let that happen, that they would find another way, that he hadn't come into this world to let her go back into the darkness. Lilith looked at him for a long time. Then she asked quietly, "Then why did you come?" Dan answered without hesitation, "So everyone could go home. Everyone." Lilith was silent. The channel between them was quiet, but Dan could feel it. Something had shifted, something deep, something ancient. She didn't agree, but she didn't refuse. That was the beginning. Cassius returned 3 weeks later. 50 inquisitors, the Order's elite, silver armor, holy blades, each with a blessing rating over 2,000 points. Behind them came 10 battle mages of the church, Archbishop Marin in white armor with a hammer, and Cassius himself at the front, on horseback, sword drawn. Holy fire burned on the blade so brightly it hurt to look at it. Bran stood on the wall, an axe in her hand, a yellow scarf around her neck. She was counting the enemies. Her lips moved. She reached 20 and said she didn't know how to go on. But there were many of them. Reyna stood nearby. Her face was calm. She had already calculated everything. The odds were bad. Not hopeless, but bad. Seraphina was on the roof, hands folded, eyes closed. She was preparing a spell, the strongest of her life. Lilith stood in the Hall of Seals, alone, in the center of the runic circle. Dan sensed her through the channel. She was preparing. For what, exactly, he was afraid to ask. Ivy was in the basement. Dan had sent her there. She didn't want to. She was screaming, saying she wasn't a little girl, that she could help, Dan looked at her, quietly said one word. Please. Ivy fell silent, lowered her eyes, went down to the basement, turned around at the door, told him not to dare die, because she needed breakfast tomorrow morning. Dan nodded. He promised. Cassius didn't wait. He didn't offer to back down. He didn't speak. He just attacked. The first wave, 20 inquisitors. The holy blades sliced through the protective dome like paper. Divine magic against demonic. The perfect weapon. The dome Lilith had created through Dan held for 3 minutes. Then it burst. Seraphina unleashed darkness. Half the attackers fell. Sleep. Deep. Instantaneous. But the other half held firm. The holy protection on their armor neutralized the demonic magic. Reyna raised walls of ice. Different from last time. Sharp. Dangerous. Not for separation. For killing. Dan didn't stop her. These weren't mercenaries. These were people who had come to kill. Bran lunged from the wall. The axe whistled. The first inquisitor flew 10 meters away. The second raised his shield. Bran split the shield in half, and the arm behind it. She roared. Holy fury. The yellow scarf fluttered like a flag. 12 former mercenaries held the walls. It was bad, but they held. Dan stood in the courtyard. The channel was open wide. 4 streams: Bran's fire, Seraphina's silk, Reyna's ice, Lilith's ocean. All through him. Every spell, every blow, every shield. He felt it all. His head was splitting. Blood was running from his nose. Too much power, too fast. But he held on. He didn't let go. Cassius broke through the gates, alone. The inquisitors were clearing the way. He was heading for the Hall of the Seal. Dan knew. He felt it. The ritual. Cassius was carrying an artifact, an ancient one, capable of wringing power from its bearer. If he reached Lilith and activated the ritual, it would all be over. Dan ran. Across the courtyard, down the corridor, through the hall. His legs wouldn't obey him. His body was burning. The channel was devouring him from the inside. He ran into the Hall of the Seal. Lilith stood in the center, in a circle of runes. The runes were burning, not with a dim fire, bright, blinding. She had activated the seal. She was about to go back, to seal herself away, alone, now. Before Cassius could reach her, Dan screamed, not words, just a sound, desperate. Lilith looked up, looked at him. Her eyes held everything. 1,000 years, loneliness, resolution, pain, and something else, something gentle, something that had only appeared in these past 7 months. When someone cooked her porridge and set tea on the windowsill, she quietly told him to leave, that this was the only way, that the abyss was locked inside her, that if Cassius gained her power, he would also gain the abyss, and the world would perish. She had to leave, now. Dan stood there. Blood dripped from his nose onto the stone. His body trembled. The channel burned. He did what he wasn't supposed to be able to do, what contradicted every rule of the contract. He gave up the channel, on his own, voluntarily. He said it out loud. If you're leaving, the contract is useless. I don't want your power. I want you. The channel snapped. Silence. Absolute. Lilith felt it like a blow. Her eyes widened. Without the channel, she was free, completely. All her power returned to her. But without the channel, she became vulnerable to holy weapons. Cassius burst into the hall. He saw Lilith without the contract's protection, without the channel, vulnerable. His face twisted with triumph. He raised his sword. Holy fire flared. He swung. And 3 voices rang out simultaneously. Seraphina, Reyna, Bran. 3 women stood in the hall's doorway. Each spoke the same words. Each renounced her part of the contract, voluntarily, in Lilith's favor. The channel did not break. It redirected. The power of the 4 flowed not through Dan, through Lilith, directly. Bran's fire, Seraphina's silk, Reyna's ice, and Lilith's own ocean. The 4 streams merged into one. Cassius froze. The sword stopped a centimeter from Lilith. The power around her became so dense that the air thickened. Lilith raised her hand, calmly. Cassius backed away. For the first time, fear was on his face. Real fear. He said she was unworthy of this power, that he was a descendant of the hero, that the right to her power belonged to him. Dan stood without a channel, without power, an ordinary man. He quietly answered for Lilith, said that Cassius was right. Dan was not worthy of her power, but he was worthy of her trust, and Cassius was not. Lilith turned to Dan. She looked at him. 4 women stood behind him, without a command, without words. They simply stood there. Cassius saw it. 5 beings, 4 demons and a man, not an army, a family. Bran stepped forward. The axe whistled. A yellow scarf flashed through the air. Cassius didn't even have time to raise his sword. The hall fell silent. Lilith stood in the center of the circle, alive. The runes faded one by one. She was crying, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks, down her chin, dripped onto the stone. For the first time in 1,000 years, she wasn't crying from pain. Dan approached, took her hand, spoke softly. "Let's go home. I'll make some tea." The morning after the battle was quiet. Dan woke up in the kitchen. He had fallen asleep at the table, his cheek on the tabletop. A mug of cold tea stood nearby. He sat up. His body ached, every muscle. The channel was different, not like before, quieter, softer, like a river after the flood. The power flowed, but differently. Not through him to them, between everyone. 5 bound together, equals. Dan went out into the yard. The walls were still standing, battered, cracked, but standing. 12 former mercenaries were clearing away the debris, silently. Some had bandages, all alive. Bran sat by the gate, an axe on her lap. A yellow scarf with brown stains. She was cleaning the blade. She saw Dan. She smiled, broadly, showing her fangs. She said it had been a good fight. Dan sat down beside her. He said, "Yes, good." Bran was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly that she'd been scared. When he ran into the hall alone, unarmed, powerless, she said she'd wanted to run after him, but her legs wouldn't obey her. For the first time in her life. Because for the first time in her life, she had something to lose. Dan put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The next few days were spent recovering. The castle had been damaged, but not critically. Rhaena drew up a repair plan. 14 points. Bran carried stones. Seraphina organized the people. Dan cooked. 3 times a day, 20 servings, more. People came to them. News of the battle spread, not as a rumor, like an earthquake. The Grand Inquisitor of the Order is dead. His elite squad is defeated. Archbishop Merrin fled the battlefield. Von Aerten Castle stands, and its master is feeding the survivors again. Because yes, Dan fed the captured Inquisitors too, those who surrendered, those who stayed. Seraphina said he was hopeless. Rhaena said he was predictable. Bran said he was right. Lilith said nothing. She just helped him carry the cauldron. A week later, a messenger arrived at the castle, from the kingdom of Veldmar, with a letter from the Baron, an official invitation to an audience. The House of Von Aerten was recognized, not just as a noble estate, as an equal baron. Rhaena read the letter 3 times. Then she carefully placed it on the table. Her hands were shaking. She said this was the beginning, that through Veldmar they could build a network, alliances, trade, protection. Dan nodded. He looked at her. He asked if she wanted to go. As an ambassador for the House of Von Aerten, Rhaena looked up. There was something in her eyes that Dan rarely saw, excitement. She said it was a serious responsibility, that preparation was needed, that she would draw up a plan. Dan said he trusted her. Rhaena fell silent. Then, in an even voice, she said, "Thank you." She stood up. She left. Dan heard her exhale quietly in the hallway, like someone who had held their breath for a very long time. A month passed. Rhaena returned from Veldmar with a trade agreement. Ivy had grown 2 centimeters. Bran had learned all the letters and was reading slowly, but on her own. Seraphina had stopped wearing the illusion in the castle. She simply walked around with a tail and horns. None of the former mercenaries flinched. They'd gotten used to it. Lilith came down from the tower every day. She sat in the kitchen. She read, or didn't read. Sometimes she helped cook, poorly. She didn't know how to cook at all. 1,000 years as a queen, and she'd never once held a vegetable knife. Dan taught her, patiently. He showed her how to cut, how to stir, how not to burn it. Lilith listened intently, like a military briefing. One morning, Dan stood by the hearth. He was brewing the local equivalent of coffee. Beans he roasted himself. He'd been fine-tuning the temperature for weeks. He'd achieved something close, not perfect, but warm, fragrant, his own. He poured it into mugs, 6 mugs, 5 on the table. Ivy placed the 6th one herself, next to hers, as always. They sat at the table. Morning, sunlight streaming through the window. Lilith drank her coffee, slowly, with the same expression she'd had when she tasted his porridge on the first day, like a person learning to feel all over again. Serafina sat on the table. Her legs dangled, her tail swayed lazily. She teased Reyna. Reyna replied in an icy tone, but the corner of her mouth was turned up. Bran was eating. A lot. So always. A yellow scarf around her neck. The alphabet book in her pocket. She was reading the signs in the castle now, slowly, syllable by syllable. But she was reading, and every time she'd lift her head and look at Dan, checking if she was right. Dan nodded. He always nodded. Ivy sat next to Dan, close, without touching, but close. She ate in silence. Sometimes she nudged him with her elbow. He nudged her back. Their ritual, small, quiet. No one talked about it. Dan looked at them, at everyone, and thought. Quietly, not about the abyss, not about the seals, not about wars. About this, about tomorrow, about the sun, about coffee, about how Lilith held her mug with both hands, about how Serafina laughed, about how Reyna pretended not to be smiling, about how Bran read syllable by syllable, about how Ivy nudged him with her elbow. There was a lot ahead. The abyss, the remaining 6 seals, the politics of the continent, war with the church, the demon lords who had learned that Lilith had returned. 1,000 problems, 1,000 dangers, 1,000 days to live through. But all that was later. Right now, it was morning. The kitchen, the sun, coffee. 5 women and 1 guy from Portland. A family. Strange, impossible, entirely his. Dan finished his coffee, set down the mug, looked at Lilith. Lilith looked at him. The connection between them hummed quietly, steady, like a heartbeat. Like the morning light, like the first sip of coffee. Dan thought that for the unluckiest guy in the world, this felt a lot like luck.